There is a photograph taken sometime in the late 1950s. Tina Onassis standing on the deck of the most famous private yacht in the world, the sun on the water behind her, diamonds at her throat, a smile arranged perfectly for whoever was holding the camera. She is 20-something years old, and she is, by any external measure, living a life that most people would struggle to even imagine. And yet if you know what to look for, if you know what came before and what came after, you can see something in that image that the smile is trying very hard to conceal. She is already somewhere slightly distant from the scene she is standing in, already, in some quiet internal way, beginning to disappear. Her name was Athena Mary Livanos. The world knew her as Tina, and the story of what her life actually was, beneath the yachts and the diamonds and the famous name she married into and was eventually discarded from, is one that almost nobody has ever told properly. This is that story. Tina Levanos was born on March 19th, 1929, in London. Her father was Stavros Livanos, a man known in the tightly sealed world of Greek shipping as something very close to its king. He was not the kind of rich that announces itself loudly. He was the kind of rich that has been present long enough to become something more like a condition of the atmosphere. Quiet, enormous, and taken entirely for granted by everyone inside it. He had built his empire through discipline, through an almost monastic focus on the business of moving goods across oceans, and through the tight web of relationships that defined the Greek shipping world. Those relationships were everything. They were maintained through marriages, through loyalty, through the careful management of who was inside the circle and who was not. Her mother was Arietta Zefiriou, from another prominent Greek family, and the household they built together was one in which appearances were everything and everything had its proper place. Feelings were not a subject for discussion. Difficulty was not something you admitted to. You were presented to the world in a particular way, and you maintained that presentation because in the world the Livanos family inhabited, your presentation was your value. This was not a household that produced women who knew how to fall apart. It produced women who knew how to look as though falling apart was something that happened to other people. Tina grew up between London, Monte Carlo, and the estates of the European Greek elite. She was educated as a young woman of her class, was expected to be educated in languages, in social grace, in the performance of effortless composure. She was strikingly beautiful, with dark eyes and a quality of presence that photographs captured even when they were trying to capture everything around her. She was also, underneath the composure she had been taught to maintain, a genuinely warm person, sensitive. The kind of person who felt things more than the world around her, gave her permission to show. She had an older sister, Eugenia, and the two of them grew up inside the gilded architecture of the Livanos world as companions and as, in the quiet understanding of that world, prospects. Their marriages, when they came, would be alliances as much as they would be love stories. The right husband meant the right family, the right connections, the continuation of something larger than any individual life within it. That was simply the code of the world they had been born into. Nobody said it in those terms. Nobody had to. It was understood the way the weather is understood. You did not debate it. You dressed for it. And so when a man arrived who was powerful enough and wealthy enough and ambitious enough to be considered suitable, the negotiations that would shape the rest of Tina's life began. She was a teenager when those negotiations started. She was 17 years old when they concluded. Aristotle Socrates Onassis was born in 1906 in Smyrna, in what is now Turkey, to a Greek family of modest standing. His world was torn apart when he was a teenager, when the Greek-Turkish War and the catastrophic population exchange of the early 1920s forced his family from the city they had always known. He arrived in South America with essentially nothing, no connections, no inheritance, no name that opened doors, What followed was one of the great self-invention stories of the 20th century. He built a tobacco business in Buenos Aires from almost nothing. He turned those profits into shipping. He bought his first ships at prices that the established shipping world considered foolish, and that turned out to be visionary. By the time he was in his 30s, Aristotle Onassis was one of the wealthiest men in the world. Not comfortable, not successful by conventional measures. One of the wealthiest men alive. But Onassis understood something that naked wealth alone could not give him. The world of the great Greek shipping families was a closed world, and it had its own social architecture that money could not simply purchase. Stavros Livanos was the man at its center. To belong to that world fully, to have the legitimacy that would complete the picture he was building of himself, you had to marry into it. He had looked at both Livanos' daughters. Eugenia, the older one, was already spoken for. She would marry Stavros Niarchos, the both there, other titan of the Greek shipping world, in a pairing that must have seemed at the time like a natural joining of two great forces. His attention settled on Tina. They married on December 28, 1946 in New York City. Tina was 17 years old when they became engaged, and barely 18 by the time the wedding took place. Onassis was 40. The press covered it as the kind of event it was, a union of two great shipping dynasties, a marriage that made perfect sense in the ledger of that world. Tina wore a gown with a long train. She was, as every account from that day records, absolutely radiant. She had no way of knowing what she had actually agreed to. She could not have known. The truth of Aristotle Onassis was not something he revealed in courtship. The courtship version of Aristotle Onassis was charming and attentive, and full of the electric energy of a man who had built everything from nothing and intended to keep building. The marriage version was something considerably more complicated. The life Tina entered as Mrs. Onassis was, on its surface, a kind of dream made solid. There was the Christina O., Onassis's famous yacht, a converted Canadian frigate that he had transformed into the most extravagant private vessel in the world. It had a swimming pool with a mosaic floor that could be elevated to become a dance floor. It had a cinema, multiple dining rooms, a bar whose stools were upholstered in a material that Onassis liked to describe to guests with a particular relish. It had a crew of dozens. It was so excessive and so spectacular that when it arrived in a harbour, people stopped whatever they were doing and stared. It was not a boat. It was a statement. Tina was the hostess of that world, and she was extraordinary at it. She had been raised for exactly this, to move through gilded rooms as though they were ordinary. To make a prime minister feel at ease beside a movie star, beside a shipping magnate. To ensure that everything ran perfectly while appearing as though nothing was being managed at all. Winston Churchill was a regular guest on the Christina O. Grace Kelly. Greta Garbo, the most famous people in the world, came through those doors, and Tina welcomed each of them with a warmth that everyone who encountered her consistently described as genuine, not performed. Genuine. That distinction mattered, and the people who knew her felt it. She and Aristotle had 2 children. Alexander, born in 1948, whom Onassis received with the pride of a man who had been waiting for precisely this proof of dynasty. And Christina, born in 1950, whom Onassis received with considerably less warmth. He had wanted a second son. He had wanted more dynasty, more continuation, more of himself projected forward into the future. Christina was a daughter, and Onassis's disappointment was not something he took particular care to conceal. It settled over Christina from the beginning. That knowledge that she had arrived as the wrong thing, and she would spend her entire life trying to resolve it. Tina loved her children deeply. That is one of the things that almost everyone who has written about her or spoken about her agrees on without qualification. She was the present parent, The warm one, the one who was actually there for the ordinary moments as well as the dramatic ones. In a marriage where Aristotle was frequently absent, physically and emotionally, caught up in the perpetual motion of his business and his social life and his other appetites, Tina was the constant. She read to them. She knew their friends. She was the parent who remembered what mattered to them on any given day. That was not nothing. In that family, in that world, that was, in fact, quite a lot. But the truth of being married to Aristotle Onassis was something that no amount of yachts and diamonds and famous guests could obscure forever. He was a man who consumed people rather than partnered with them. He was brilliant. Yes, he was vital and charismatic and capable of making you feel, when his attention was on you, that you were the only person who had ever existed. But his attention did not stay on Tina for long, and it was not designed to. He had married her for reasons that had more to do with Stavros Livanos than with Tina herself. And once the acquisition was complete, the object of the acquisition became, inevitably, somewhat less interesting. He was unfaithful almost from the beginning. This was not concealed with particular care. In the world they moved in, a man's affairs were understood as his prerogative. They were not discussed openly. They were absorbed. The wife smiled and appeared and performed and carried whatever she was feeling in the silence that the world around her had constructed specifically to hold it. That was simply what was done. And Tina did it. For years, with a composure that everyone who saw her at public events described as impeccable, she also during those years suffered. She suffered miscarriages, multiple pregnancies that ended in loss and were mourned in private, without public acknowledgement, without the kind of community support that such losses deserve. Each one was absorbed into the larger silence that defined her emotional life within the marriage. There was no space carved out for her grief. There was no language available for it. You lost a pregnancy, and you recovered, and you appeared at the next event, looking exactly as you were supposed to look. The losses accumulated quietly, the way all the other things she was not permitted to express accumulated quietly, building up somewhere inside her that had no outlet. But composure is not the same as peace, and the price of composure, paid in silence over years, accumulates in ways that eventually become impossible to ignore. Tina had absorbed affairs before. She had looked away as the women in her world were expected to look away, had told herself whatever she needed to tell herself to keep going. But in 1957, something changed that could not be absorbed, something that could not be looked away from. Maria Callas was, by 1957, the most famous opera singer in the world. Born in New York to Greek parents, she had transformed herself into one of those rare figures who transcend the art form they work in. She was a phenomenon. Her voice was unlike anything the operatic world had encountered. Her performances were events in the truest sense, occasions that people traveled across countries to attend. She had undergone a famous dramatic physical transformation, losing an enormous amount of weight in a short period, emerging as not just a great singer, but a genuinely striking visual presence. She was magnetic and tempestuous and absolutely certain of her own exceptionalism. And she was right to be certain, because the exceptionalism was real. She was also, when she entered the Onassis orbit, married. Her husband was Giovanni Battista Meneghini, an Italian industrialist who had devoted years of his life to supporting her career, who had believed in her and financed her and stood beside her as she became one of the immortals of music. None of that mattered particularly to Onassis, and in the end it did not matter particularly to Callas either. He met her at a party in Venice in 1957, hosted by the great socialite Elsa Maxwell. Tina was there. Meneghini was there. Everyone was there. And between Onassis and Callas, something ignited that would consume all four of them and ultimately devastate at least two of their lives. Onassis pursued her with the same ferocious single-mindedness he brought to every acquisition that mattered to him. He wanted her, therefore he would have her. The fact that both of them were married was a logistical matter, not a moral one. It was the kind of obstacle that existed to be moved. By the summer of 1959, the affair was known to everyone in the circles where these people moved. Onassis arranged a cruise on the Christina O with a guest list that included Winston Churchill and his wife Tina and the Meneghines. It was, in retrospect, an almost incomprehensible piece of audacity. To place your wife and your lover on the same vessel in the company of one of the most famous men in the world. But Onassis had never particularly concerned himself with the comfort of the people his actions inconvenienced. By the time that cruise ended, Onassis and Callas were inseparable. Meneghini had understood with final clarity what was happening, and both marriages were effectively finished. For Tina, this was the thing she could not absorb. She had endured years of infidelity with a composure that had cost her more than anyone around her ever acknowledged. But Callas was different. Callas was world famous. The affair was not a private arrangement, conducted in the shadows of their social world. It was on the front pages of newspapers across Europe and America. Tina was no longer the wife whose husband strayed discreetly within the private architecture of their world. She was the wife, being publicly, ostentatiously replaced by the most celebrated woman in opera. There was no composure adequate to that. There was no smile large enough to cover it. She filed for divorce in 1960. She was 31 years old. The divorce was granted in Alabama, a legal convenience of the era, and Tina walked away with a settlement, with custody arrangements for her children, and with the beginning of something that would take years to fully understand as the unraveling it was. She left the marriage, but the marriage in various forms did not entirely leave her. After the divorce, Tina did what people do when they have been living inside something overwhelming for a very long time. She looked for something stable, something quiet, something that looked, from the outside, like safety. In 1961, she married John Spencer Churchill, the Marquess of Blandford, heir to Blenheim Palace, and to one of the oldest aristocratic titles in England. He was, on paper, everything that Onassis was not. Ancient lineage instead of self-made fortune. English country life instead of Mediterranean spectacle. Tweeds and shooting seasons and the ordered, unhurried rhythms of the British aristocracy instead of a yacht full of celebrities moving at speed across the Mediterranean. It was an attempt at a normal life. Tina had spent her entire adulthood inside one of the most extreme environments imaginable. Perhaps what she needed now was simply order, a husband who came home in the evenings, a house that was a home rather than a stage, children growing up in green countryside rather than on the deck of a famous yacht. She had never had ordinary. She went looking for it. But ordinary turned out to be more complicated than it looked from the outside. The Marquis of Blandford had his own difficulties, his own troubled relationship with alcohol, his own financial pressures that Blenheim Palace, magnificent and historically significant and perpetually expensive, only amplified. He was not a cruel man. But he was not a steady one either, and Tina herself was, by this point, carrying things that did not simply disappear because the postcode had changed. She had lived at such extremes for so long that ordinary life could not quite contain her. She was restless. She drank in the way that people drink when they are using alcohol to manage something that has no other management available to it. She found it difficult to settle into the slower rhythms that the marriage and the life required. And her children, Alexander and Christina, were living increasingly within their father's orbit, drawn into the Onassis world in ways that caused Tina a grief that had very few outlets. She was their mother. But Aristotle, Onassis was their world. and the gravitational pull of that world was something she could feel but could not counter. The marriage to Blandford lasted several years but never became what she had hoped it might be. It was a marriage entered into in good faith by two people who were both, in different ways, not quite able to provide what the other needed. It ended without particular drama, which was in its own way a kind of sadness. She had been a Livanos, then an Onassis, now briefly a Spencer Churchill, and none of those identities had ever quite been her own. She belonged, by this point, to too many worlds, and not quite fully to any single one. If there is one moment in Tina's life that functions as the point of no return, the thing from which she did not come back, it is January 1973. Her son Alexander was 24 years old. He was, by many accounts, Tina's deepest attachment among her children, not because she loved Christina less, but because Alexander carried something of her in him, her gentleness, her sensitivity, a quality of emotional availability that his father had never possessed and had, in fact, seemed to view with a mixture of bafflement and mild contempt. Alexander was a young man who seemed genuinely capable of the kind of love that his family's world did not make particularly easy, who seemed to want a life that was less consumed by spectacle and ambition than the one he had been born into. He had also, by his mid-20s, begun to establish something of an independent existence. He had a relationship of his own, a woman he loved, plans that were his rather than his father's. He was slowly and with difficulty becoming his own person. And then, on January 23rd, he was piloting an amphibious plane at an airport outside Athens when it crashed catastrophically on takeoff. He suffered massive brain injuries. He was placed in intensive care. Aristotle Onassis, for perhaps the first time in his remarkable and ruthless life, encountered something that money could not solve. He flew neurosurgeons in from around the world. He spent whatever was required without hesitation or calculation. He sat by his son's bedside in a way he had not always sat beside his son during the years when sitting beside him might have mattered in a different way, and he faced what he had never had to face before, the absolute limit of what power and wealth could do. Alexander Onassis never regained consciousness. He died exactly 1 month after the crash. He was 24 years old. For Tina, the death of her son broke something that had no name and could not be repaired. She had already carried so much, the years of humiliation inside her marriage, the very public affair with Callas, the divorce, the rootlessness of everything that followed. She had carried all of it, in part because she had her children. They were the thing that required her to keep going, that gave the keeping going a purpose. Alexander's death removed the floor from under her in a way that no amount of composure could address, because this was not a thing that composure was designed to handle. People who knew her in the months after his death described a woman who had gone somewhere inside herself and could not fully return. The drinking that had been present for years accelerated into something more consuming. The social mask she had maintained so brilliantly for so long became harder to reconstruct from one day to the next. She was grieving in a way that had absolutely nowhere to go, inside a world that had never built any infrastructure for the kind of pain she was carrying. And then, in one of the most extraordinary and troubling turns in a life that had already contained more than its share of both, Tina made a decision that left almost everyone who knew her at a loss for how to respond. She married Stavros Niarchos. Stavros Niarchos was, alongside Aristotle Onassis, the other titan of the Greek shipping world. The rivalry between them was one of the defining dramas of post-war European wealth, something that went so far beyond ordinary business competition that it had long since become something more like an obsession on both sides. They built bigger yachts to outdo each other. They purchased more glamorous islands. They pursued the same women, attended the same parties, moved through the same rooms, with the particular tension of two men who had each decided that the other was the only real measure of their own success. To be in a room with both of them was, by all accounts, to feel the air change. But here is what makes this marriage something beyond simply strange. Stavros Niarchos had previously been married to Eugenia Livanos, Tina's own sister, the sister she had grown up beside, shared a childhood with, known in the intimate way that only siblings know each other. The sister who had, by various accounts, been Onassis's original interest before circumstances directed him toward Tina instead. Eugenia had married Niarchos in 1947, 1 year after Tina married Onassis, and the four of them had existed within the same closed social world for decades. Two sisters married to two rivals, a situation of such concentrated claustrophobia that it seems almost fictional. Eugenia had died in 1970. The official finding was an overdose of barbiturates. She was 45 years old. There had been a Greek government investigation. There had been questions, serious and pointed questions, about the circumstances of her death, about what had happened in the hours before it, about the nature of the marriage itself. The investigation concluded that the overdose was self-administered, but the questions did not disappear with the conclusion. The people who had loved Eugenia did not entirely forgive Niarchos. They carried their suspicions quietly, the way you carry something you cannot prove but cannot put down. And yet, the following year, Tina married him. No one has ever been entirely able to explain this decision in terms that feel satisfying or complete. Some who have studied her life suggest that the grief after Alexander's death had left her judgment, simply gone, that she was making decisions from a place so far inside her pain that ordinary calculation had become impossible. Others suggest there was a connection between her and Niarchos that had existed for years in ways that were not visible to the outside world, something that had been present beneath the surface of their long acquaintance. Others have suggested something darker, that it was an act directed inward, a punishment of herself by a woman who had lost too much and could no longer imagine what care for herself was supposed to look like, or whether she deserved it. What is certain is that almost everyone around her was horrified. Aristotle Onassis was reportedly furious, which from a man of his own considerable moral history was a particular kind of irony that was not lost on the people who observed it. Christina was devastated in a way that went beyond ordinary family disapproval. She had lost her brother. Her mother was now married to the man widely believed to have played some role in the death of her aunt. The Livanos family reacted with something close to disbelief, and Tina, 42 years old, still raw with grief for her son, became Mrs. Niarchos. The marriage to Niarchos did not bring Tina peace. It is difficult to imagine how it could have, and perhaps, on some level, she did not expect that it would. She was a woman who had, by the early 1970s, lost the defining architecture of her life piece by piece over the course of more than a decade. The marriage that had shaped her entire adulthood was behind her. Her son was gone. Her relationship with Christina was loving but complicated, weighted down by the impossible emotional geometry of the Onassis world and by the grief they were both carrying in different ways. Her sister was gone. Her heart, which had been a medical concern for some years, was deteriorating. She was 43, 44 years old, still young by any objective measure, but worn in ways that went far deeper than years. Tina Onassis was, during these years, trying to maintain her relationship with her mother across the enormous difficulty of the Niarchos marriage. She loved Tina. That was never in question, but the particular circumstances made loving her complicated in ways that Christina, who had her own considerable burdens to carry, struggled to navigate. She would visit, she would call. She would try to be present in her mother's life in the ways available to her. But there was always the shadow of what Tina had chosen, and what that choice had meant for everyone who had loved Eugenia and what it said about where her mother was inside herself, that she had made it. Tina moved through those final years in a kind of gilded drift, Paris primarily. The hotels and apartments that the very wealthy inhabit without quite inhabiting, present in the physical sense without being anchored to anything. The social world continued around her, the dinners and the events and the parties, the world that kept moving, regardless of what was happening inside the people moving through it. Those who encountered her described different versions of the same woman. Some saw someone still trying to maintain the surface, still gracious, still composed, still performing with professional competence the role she had been rehearsing since childhood. Others described someone whose famous warmth had become something slightly mechanical, who reached for a glass too often, who laughed a beat too quickly at things that were not quite funny, whose eyes did not always match whatever expression her face was wearing. Aristotle Onassis was himself dying by this point. After Alexander's death, he had aged, with a speed that people who knew him described as almost visible. His marriage to Jackie Kennedy, which had begun in 1968, with enormous public fanfare and considerable private calculation on both sides, had become cold and litigious. He was suffering from myasthenia gravis, a progressive condition that was steadily draining the physical vitality that had always been the most visible expression of who he was. The man who had seemed almost supernatural in his appetite for life, who had seemed to operate on different terms than ordinary people, was diminishing. He was becoming, for the first time, human-scaled. Neither of them, in those final years, was the person they had been when they first met. They were what remained of those people after everything that had happened to and between them. And the dynasty they had built together, the children and the shared history, and the years of passion and fury and disappointment in the things that could not be taken back, was fraying at every edge. On the morning of October 10th, 1974, Tina Levanos was found dead in her room at the Hotel de Crillon in Paris. She was 45 years old. The official cause of death was pulmonary edema, a build-up of fluid in the lungs consistent with her underlying heart condition. It was, medically, a plausible and sufficient conclusion. She was alone when they found her. That detail is the one that stays with you. This woman who had spent her entire adult life surrounded by people, by staff and guests and the perpetual motion of the most glamorous social world of her era, who had never in her adult life been truly alone, died alone in a hotel room in Paris. Not on the yacht, not in one of the houses, not surrounded by the family she had devoted so much of herself to holding together. In a hotel room, as if she had been passing through and simply had not made it to wherever she was going next. The world's response was, by any measure, muted. There were obituaries. There were brief and proper acknowledgements, but the coverage was a fraction of what her former husband would receive when he followed her 6 months later in March 1975. She was identified, consistently and almost exclusively, as the former Mrs. Onassis, the first wife, the one before Jackie. As if the primary thing the world needed to know about her was her relationship to someone else's story. Tina Onassis was 24 years old when her mother died. She had lost her brother less than 2 years before. She was now, at 24, without both of them. She would spend the rest of her own tragically short life. She died in 1988 at 37. Carrying the weight of these losses alongside the weight of an empire she had never wanted, and a loneliness she could not cure. She had adored her mother, and her mother was gone before Christina had been given anywhere near enough time with her. That is a particular kind of grief. The grief of the things that were never going to be resolved now, because the person you needed to resolve them with was no longer there. It would be easy to tell Tina Levanos' story as a straightforward tragedy. The beautiful girl from the great family, who was married off too young to a man too large, for any ordinary life, who was publicly humiliated, who lost too much, who was consumed by a world that used her, and then moved on to shinier things. And there is truth in that telling. The constraints on her life were real. The expectations placed on her were enormous and specific, and had very little room in them for anything as inconvenient as her actual inner life, the grief she was not permitted to show, the pain she was required to carry in silence, the losses that accumulated without adequate acknowledgement. But to reduce her to pure tragedy is to erase her in a different way than the world already erased her. She was also a woman of genuine gifts. Her social intelligence was extraordinary. The ability to hold together a world as demanding and as ego-driven as the Onassis orbit required real skill, the kind of skill that is easy to overlook, precisely because it looks effortless when it is being done well. She was, by every account of people who knew her, genuinely warm, genuinely kind, capable of a quality of human connection that the glittering world she lived in did not particularly reward or even particularly notice. She made people feel seen. That is not a small thing. In a world full of people performing for each other, she was someone who actually looked at you. She loved her children with a consistency and a presence that stood in stark contrast to the way their father moved through their lives. She maintained friendships across decades. She kept showing up to the things that mattered, even when showing up required more than she had. She was not someone who simply collapsed under the weight of what she carried, even when the weight was considerable and the support was almost non-existent. The pattern that emerges when you look at the women who moved through the innermost circle of the Onassis world is a difficult one to look at directly. Tina Levanos, dead at 45. Her sister Eugenia Livanos, dead at 45, in circumstances that were never fully resolved to everyone's satisfaction. Tina Onassis, dead at 37, having spent her adult life in a desperate and largely unsuccessful search for love and stability. Maria Callas, dead at 53, having spent her final years in near-total isolation in a Paris apartment, waiting for something that was never going to arrive. The men in this story, Onassis and Niarchos, both died in their 60s and 80s, having accumulated wealth of a kind that most people cannot comprehend, having moved through the world with impunity, and having left behind them, in both cases, a trail of women who did not survive the experience of being close to them. This is not a simple argument, and the world does not reduce to simple arguments. People are complicated. Circumstances are complicated. The forces that shaped these women's lives were multiple and not reducible to any single cause. But the pattern is there. The pattern is consistent. And it deserves to be named rather than smoothed over in the interest of a cleaner narrative. There is one final thing worth saying about Tina Levanos, about the woman beneath all of it, beneath the photographs and the names she carried, and the world that defined her primarily in relation to other people. She was born in London in 1929 to a family of extraordinary privilege and extraordinary expectation. She was raised to be the perfect wife, and by the measures her world used, she was. She was beautiful and gracious, and warmly effective and devoted to her children, and faithful in ways that her husband never came close to reciprocating. She did everything that was asked of her. She performed every role to the standard required. She maintained the composure. She absorbed the losses. She kept showing up. She died in Paris in 1974, alone in a hotel room, at 45 years old. She had lived through more than most people encounter in 3 lifetimes, and she had borne almost all of it in the silence that the world around her had constructed specifically to hold exactly that kind of pain. The silence of women who are expected to be beautiful and useful and undisturbing, and who learn over years of careful training that their actual experience of their actual lives is not the subject anyone around them has signed up to hear about. The story the world has told about her when it has told any story at all, is the story of the first wife, the placeholder, the one before Jackie, the cautionary tale of a woman who could not survive the weight of everything that was placed on her. That story is easy to package and easy to repeat, and it has the advantage of being, in its broad outlines, not entirely untrue. But it is not who she was. It is the part that was easiest to see, the most dramatic, the most photogenic in its tragedy. The rest of her, the warmth and the persistence and the music she loved and the children she adored, and the real human being underneath the pearls and the composed expressions in the photographs, required more effort to find. And most people, across the decades since her death, have not looked. Her name was Tina Levanos. She was not a footnote. She was not simply the woman Onassis was married to before the interesting ones arrived. She was not a cautionary tale, or a placeholder, or a beautiful decoration at the edge of someone else's story. She was a person, fully complicated, fully feeling, doing her best inside a world that was not designed with her full humanity in mind, and that never made adequate room for it. She deserved more from the man she married, more from the family she entered, more from the era she lived through, more from the history that recorded her. And perhaps the least we can do, this far down the road, is tell her story the way it actually was, not as a tragedy to be observed from a comfortable distance, not as a lesson about the dangers of marrying the wrong man, but as a life, a real one with all the weight and texture and loss and love that a real life contains. Rest, Tina. You were more than any of them knew how to see.